I am Joshua, 32 years old, and my own brother destroyed my $3,000 research PC 1 week before my college graduation while my parents stood there and laughed. Before I tell you about how I ended up buying their foreclosed home at a public auction and kicking them off the lawn they used to own, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The sound of my life falling apart did not come with a scream or a dramatic crash. It sounded like a wet, electric crunch. I can still hear it crystal clear when I close my eyes. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late April. I had just gotten home from my advanced landscape architecture seminar. I pushed open the door to my off-campus apartment, and the first thing that hit me was the smell. It was the acrid, chemical stench of burning plastic mixed with the sickeningly sweet odor of neon green citrus soda. My stomach dropped into my shoes. I dropped my backpack in the hallway and ran into my bedroom. Matthew, my 28-year-old brother, was standing in the middle of my room. He was casually leaning against my desk, holding an aluminum baseball bat. At his feet lay the custom-built PC tower I had spent 3 years saving for. The tempered glass side panel was completely shattered, glittering on my cheap carpet like crushed ice. But the glass was not the worst part. The worst part was the puddle of sticky, neon green soda dripping through the top ventilation grates, seeping directly into the motherboard and the graphics card. I could hear the circuits literally frying. Pop, crackle, sizzle. A thin wisp of gray smoke curled up from the ruined metal box. Matthew tossed the baseball bat onto my unmade bed. He wiped his sticky hands on his expensive designer jeans, looked at the smoking ruin of my machine, and smirked. My legs went entirely weak. I reached out and grabbed the doorframe just to keep from collapsing. Inside that hard drive was 6 months of my life. My entire master's thesis. Hundreds of intricate CAD drawings, complex 3D renders of sustainable urban park designs, technical specifications, and cost analyses. Everything I needed for the upcoming Sterling design competition was drowning in that toxic green puddle. I stared at him. I could not breathe. "Why?" I whispered. Matthew shrugged his shoulders, looking completely unbothered. "I texted you 3 hours ago. I told you I needed a ride to the mall to meet Sarah. You said you were too busy with your stupid school project. Well, now you aren't busy. Problem solved." He smiled. It was a cold, arrogant smile. He knew exactly what he had done, and he knew he would face absolutely zero consequences for it. I stepped forward into the room. My heavy work boots crunched on the glass fragments. I reached out to touch my dual monitors. One of them was bent backward at a grotesque 45-degree angle where the bat had connected. The screen was black, a spiderweb of cracks radiating from the center. I dropped to my knees and pressed the power button on the main tower, even though my logical brain knew it was entirely pointless. Nothing happened. No LED lights, no cooling fans spinning up. Just the deafening silence of a dead machine and the suffocating smell of burnt electronics. Then, I heard the front door open. My parents had emergency keys to my apartment. I gave them copies 2 years ago just in case of a real medical emergency. Apparently, Matthew needing a chauffeur to go buy sneakers qualified as an emergency to them. My mother's voice drifted down the hallway, cheerful and completely oblivious. She walked into the bedroom, my father trailing right behind her. Mom stopped. She looked at the smashed computer on the floor. She looked at the baseball bat on my bed. She looked at Matthew, and then she looked down at me, kneeling in the glass. I waited for the explosion. I waited for her to scream at Matthew, to demand to know what he had done, to grab him by the collar. Instead, Mom let out a long, heavy sigh. It was the exact same exasperated sigh she used whenever I forgot to take out the trash. She looked at me, her eyes full of annoyance. "Oh, Joshua, please don't look so dramatic. It is just a toy. You can play your video games later." "A toy?" My voice cracked. I scrambled to my feet. "Mom, that machine cost $3,000. My entire thesis is on there. My graduation depends on this. The competition submission is due in 8 days. Everything I have worked for is on that hard drive." Dad squeezed past Mom into the room. He was a big, imposing man who always equated physical labor with real work. He looked down at the smoking PC and actually chuckled. A low, rumbling laugh that made my blood run entirely cold. $3 grand for a glorified video game box, Dad scoffed, crossing his arms. I told you for years you were wasting your money, Josh. If you had put that cash into a house down payment, or maybe a college fund for your future kids instead of playing games in your bedroom, you wouldn't be crying on the floor right now. It's time to grow up. I stared at him, my jaw trembling. It is not for games. I am an architect. I design public infrastructure. That machine was my professional tool. I need it to do my actual job. Matthew reached over to my desk, grabbed a bag of my barbecue potato chips, ripped it open, and shoved a handful into his mouth. He chewed loudly. You draw pretty pictures of trees, Josh. Stop acting like you're building skyscrapers. Anyway, Mom, did you transfer the cash for my new crypto portfolio? The market is dipping. I need to buy in today. Mom's face instantly transformed. The annoyance vanished, replaced by pure, adoring warmth. She smiled at Matthew like he had just announced he cured a disease. Yes, honey. I sent the money this morning. Just be careful with it. We know you are going to make it big this time. I looked at the three of them. My entire livelihood was literally smoking at their feet, destroyed because my 28-year-old brother threw a toddler tantrum, and they were casually discussing his imaginary crypto wealth. I pointed a shaking finger at the wreckage. He committed a crime. This is destruction of property. That bat didn't fall from the sky. He poured soda directly into the vents on purpose. Mom's eyes narrowed. Her voice turned sharp and warning. Matthew told me his drink slipped. He tripped and accidentally knocked it over. Why do you always assume the absolute worst about your brother? You have been jealous of him since you were little boys. And it is getting really ugly, Joshua. Dad stepped closer, putting a heavy, clamping hand on my shoulder. We'll buy you a nice paper notebook from the office supply store. Maybe some colored pencils. Working by hand builds character anyway. Something inside my chest snapped. It was not a loud break. It was quiet, like a thick steel cable being severed. The burning rage inside me suddenly cooled into solid ice. I realized right then and there that I did not have parents. I had Matthew's fan club, and I was just the janitor they kept around to sweep up his messes. I shrugged Dad's hand off my shoulder. I stood up straight, looking my father dead in the eye. Get out. The room went dead silent. Mom gasped, clutching her designer purse to her chest. Excuse me? We drove 30 minutes in traffic to bring you leftover lasagna, and this is how you speak to us. Get out. I repeated, my voice dangerously calm. Leave my emergency key on the kitchen counter and get out of my apartment right now. You have 30 seconds before I call the police and press charges for breaking and entering and felony vandalism. Dad's face turned bright purple. He stepped into my personal space. You are kicking your own mother out over a metal box? After we raised you? After we put a roof over your head? You didn't do anything for me? I fired back, not blinking. You paid for Matthew's car. You paid for his 3 failed college attempts. You paid for his crypto scams. I scrubbed diner toilets at 2 a.m. to buy my own textbooks. I built that computer with my own blood and sweat. And now he destroyed it because I wouldn't be his taxi driver. 20 seconds. Matthew's smirk finally faltered. He looked at Mom, his eyes wide with sudden panic. He's bluffing, right? Mom looked at my face. She saw the absolute, unyielding ice in my eyes. She grabbed Matthew's arm. Fine. If you want to choose a machine over your own flesh and blood, go ahead. But do not come crying to us when you are miserable and alone. She marched to the kitchen, slammed the spare key onto the granite counter, and walked out. Dad muttered something about my ungrateful generation, trailing behind her. The front door slammed shut, rattling the picture frames on the wall. The silence that followed was suffocating. I slowly sank down the wall, sliding until I hit the floor, burying my face in my hands. The smell of burnt plastic filled my lungs. My defense was in 7 days. I was finished, sitting there on the floor amidst the shattered glass, My mind involuntarily dragged me back through the years. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was the culmination of 3 decades of being the invisible practice child. My brother Matthew came along 4 years after I was born, and the moment they brought him home from the hospital wrapped in a blue blanket, I ceased to exist. Matthew was the golden child. He had asthma as a toddler, which meant the entire household revolved around his comfort, his lungs, his environment. Even when he outgrew it, the pattern was permanently set. If I got a B on a math test, Dad would lecture me about work ethic. If Matthew failed 3 classes in a single semester, Mom would blame the teachers for not understanding his unique learning style and hire expensive private tutors. When we were kids, Matthew used to break my toys just to see how they worked. He snapped the wheels off my favorite skateboard. He threw my baseball glove into the neighbor's pool. Whenever I cried about it, Mom would just pat my head and say, "Boys will be boys, Joshua. Be the bigger person. You are older." I learned very early on that if I wanted anything in this world, I had to bleed for it myself. By the time I hit high school, the divide was a massive canyon. I wanted to go to a good university to study landscape architecture. My parents told me they couldn't afford to help me with tuition because the economy was tough. I understood. I didn't argue. I went out and got a job at a local diner, working the graveyard shift on weekends. I smelled like bleach, old coffee, and fryer grease for 4 years straight. I saved every single penny. I also worked summer landscaping jobs, hauling 50-pound bags of mulch until my hands were covered in cracked, bleeding blisters. Meanwhile, Matthew turned 18. Suddenly, the economy wasn't so tough anymore. They bought him a brand new car for graduation. They fully funded his tuition at a private university. He dropped out after 2 semesters because the dorm beds were uncomfortable. So they paid for him to try community college. He dropped out of that too. While I was eating ramen noodles in a cramped, freezing apartment, pulling all-nighters to maintain my scholarship, Matthew was living at home rent-free, launching a series of disastrous business ventures. First, it was a drop-shipping company selling cheap watches. Then it was a protein powder pyramid scheme. They drained his leftover college fund to finance his inventory. Every single time he failed, my parents were right there, writing him another check, telling him how brave he was for being an entrepreneur. I never asked them for a dime. I took out student loans that I knew I would be paying off until I was 40. I worked as a teaching assistant. I scrubbed floors. I did whatever it took to keep moving forward. Landscape architecture wasn't just drawing pretty pictures, no matter what my ignorant brother thought. It required massive computing power. To render high-definition 3D models of urban parks, analyze seasonal sunlight patterns, and calculate water drainage systems, you need a serious machine. A cheap laptop from a big-box store would crash attempting to load the base files. I spent 3 years buying parts for that PC. I bought the graphics card on Black Friday. I bought the processor with money I made from a landscaping gig. I bought the motherboard used from a tech forum. I researched every single compatibility metric. I spent an entire weekend assembling it on my living room floor, carefully routing the cables, applying the thermal paste. When I finally plugged it in and the internal lights hummed to life, I actually cried. It was mine. It was the first valuable thing I had ever owned that I had built with my own 2 hands. That machine allowed me to push the boundaries of my master's thesis. I was designing a sustainable green infrastructure park for low-income urban neighborhoods. Native drought-resistant plants, accessible pathways, solar-powered community spaces. It was my masterpiece. My advisor told me I was a shoo-in for the Sterling Design Competition, which came with a $15,000 cash prize and guaranteed interviews at the top firms in the country. All of that blood, all of those diner shifts, all of those blisters, all of those late nights staring at a glowing screen until my eyes burned. And Matthew destroyed it with a baseball bat and a bottle of soda because I wouldn't drive him to the mall. The unfairness of it all felt like a physical weight crushing my chest. I looked at the dark, cracked monitor. It reflected my own face, pale and exhausted. They won. My parents had finally allowed him to take the one thing I had managed to build for myself. I felt the familiar, heavy blanket of despair settling over my shoulders. I was going to fail the program. I was going to lose my degree. But then, a memory sparked in the back of my brain. A survival instinct honed by decades of living with a brother who broke my things. When I was 12, Matthew took a pair of scissors to my science fair poster the night before the presentation. Since that day, I developed a paranoid, unbreakable habit. I never, ever trusted a single copy of anything. My eyes snapped wide open. I scrambled to my feet, nearly slipping on the glass again. I dropped to my hands and knees and crawled under my heavy wooden desk. It was dark and dusty. I shoved aside the tangled, sticky power cables and the ruined surge protector. I reached my hand up to the underside of the desk surface, feeling along the rough wood. My fingers brushed against a strip of industrial Velcro. Please, please still be there. I gripped the small object attached to the Velcro and ripped it free. I crawled backward out from under the desk and held it up to the light coming through the window. It was a small, military-grade, waterproof, shockproof USB flash drive. It was coated in thick black rubber. I checked the seams. It was completely dry. No soda had reached it. No bat had smashed it. Every single night before I went to sleep, I plugged this drive into my PC, ran a full system backup of my thesis folder, and then hid it back under the desk. A fail-safe my family knew absolutely nothing about. I gripped the rubber drive so hard my knuckles turned white. The despair vanished, instantly replaced by a surging, white-hot adrenaline. Every CAD drawing, every 3D render, every cost analysis spreadsheet. It was all right here in my palm. Matthew didn't win. They didn't win. I let out a breathless, borderline hysterical laugh. It echoed in the empty apartment. Matthew thought he had ruined my life, but all he had actually done was give me the final push I needed to sever the dead weight dragging me down. I didn't have a computer anymore, but I had the data, and I had a university computer lab that opened in exactly 10 hours. The next morning, I stood outside the university architecture building at 6:45 a.m., waiting in the freezing morning mist for the janitor to unlock the doors. The second the heavy glass doors clicked open, I sprinted down the hallway to the high-performance computing lab. I swiped my student ID, claimed the corner workstation furthest from the door, and plugged the ruggedized USB drive into the port. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I held my breath as the computer chimed, recognizing the external drive. I clicked the folder. Everything loaded perfectly. The files were uncorrupted. The renders were pristine. 6 months of work, completely safe. I exhaled a breath I felt like I had been holding for 24 hours. For the next 7 days, that corner workstation became my entire universe. I did not go home. I did not sleep in a bed. I lived on 18-hour work stretches. I only left the glowing monitors to use the restroom down the hall and to scavenge the vending machines in the basement for stale peanut butter crackers and lukewarm energy drinks. The lab staff, who usually kicked students out at midnight, saw the wild, manic look in my eyes. The head lab technician, a kind older woman named Maria, noticed I was wearing the same shirt for 3 days. By day 4, she started silently leaving cups of hot black coffee and deli sandwiches next to my keyboard. She never asked questions. She just nodded at me. I refined every single detail of my thesis. I tweaked the lighting on the 3D renders until they looked like high-resolution photographs. I double-checked the structural load calculations for the solar pavilions. I practiced my defense presentation in my head while I stared at the ceiling during my 2-hour power naps, using my backpack as a pillow. I ran entirely on spite. Every time my eyes drooped, every time my brain begged for rest, I pictured my father laughing at my destroyed computer. I pictured my mother calling it a toy. I pictured Matthew chewing potato chips while my future burned. The anger was a furnace inside me, keeping me awake, keeping me sharp. On the 8th day, the morning of my thesis defense, I walked into the university gym, took a freezing cold shower, put on the one cheap suit I owned, and walked into the presentation hall. The panel consisted of 5 senior professors, including the notoriously strict department chair, Professor Davis. They sat behind a long oak table, their pens poised over legal pads, ready to tear my project apart. I stood at the podium. I didn't feel nervous. I felt untouchable. I clicked the remote, and my first slide projected onto the massive screen behind me. The defense lasted exactly 90 minutes. It was flawless. I didn't just recite facts. I told a story about community, about reviving dead concrete spaces into breathing, living ecosystems. When I showed the seasonal variation renders, how the park transformed from a lush summer canopy to a stark, beautiful winter landscape that still managed stormwater runoff, I actually heard one of the professors gasp softly. They threw their hardest questions at me. Budget overruns? I had the contingency spreadsheets. Soil contamination? I cited the specific bioremediation plant species I included in the design. I knew every square inch of my project because I had bled for it. When it was over, Professor Davis took off her reading glasses and set them on the table. She looked at me for a long, silent moment. The room was totally quiet. "Joshua," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the large room, "your approach to accessible design shouldn't just be praised. It should be the standard that this university teaches moving forward. This is the most thorough, structurally sound, and visionary sustainability analysis I have seen from a graduate student in my entire career here." The panel nodded in agreement. I had set a new benchmark for the program. 2 days later, the results of the Sterling Design Competition were announced via a massive email to the entire department. First place, Joshua Mitchell, $15,000 cash prize. I was sitting in a local diner when I read the email on my phone. I didn't cheer. I didn't jump up and down. I just stared at the screen, tears silently tracking down my face, dropping onto the cheap laminate table. I had done it. They tried to break me, they tried to sabotage me, and I had still won. Before I even walked across the stage in my cap and gown, I had 3 solid job offers. Top-tier landscape architecture firms in the city were fighting over me. I accepted a mid-level design position at Harrison & Associates, a prestigious commercial firm. Starting salary, $75,000 a year, full benefits, 401k match, and a clear path to partnership. To a guy who had spent years scrubbing toilets for minimum wage, it felt like I had just won the lottery. Graduation day was a blur of sunshine, cheering crowds, and flying caps. As I stood on the stadium grass in my black robe, holding my heavy diploma, I looked up at the massive bleachers. Thousands of parents were waving signs, holding balloons, screaming their children's names. I scanned the crowd. There were 3 empty seats in Section D where my family should have been. I hadn't sent them tickets. I hadn't even told them what day the ceremony was. For about 5 seconds, a sharp, bitter ache flared in my chest. The little boy inside me still just wanted his dad to be proud of him. But then I remembered the shattered glass. I remembered the spilled soda. The ache faded, replaced by an overwhelming, brilliant sense of freedom. They didn't deserve to be here. They didn't build this. I did. I turned my back on the empty seats and walked toward my future. 3.5 years passed. Complete radio silence. It was as if my parents and I had mutually signed a silent treaty to pretend the other didn't exist. No angry texts, no guilt-tripping voicemails on holidays. Just peace. And in that peace, I thrived in a way I never thought possible. I threw myself into my work at Harrison & Associates. I was hungry, and I was relentless. I didn't just design parks. I designed massive corporate campus landscapes, city plazas, and waterfront revitalizations. Mr. Harrison, the firm's founder, took me under his wing. He saw the grit in me. Within 1.5 years, I was promoted to senior designer. Within 3 years, my salary broke the 6-figure mark. I bought a beautiful modern townhouse in a quiet neighborhood. I finally paid off the last of my student loans. The anxiety that used to live in my chest, the constant fear of the other shoe dropping, of coming home to broken possessions, completely evaporated. And then I met Chloe. I met her at an art gallery opening I was dragged to by a colleague. She was a graphic designer, fiercely independent, with a sharp wit and kind, observant eyes. Unlike the chaotic, screaming dynamic of my family. Being with Chloe was like sitting by a warm, quiet fire. We didn't play games. We supported each other. When I told her about my family, about the destroyed computer and the estrangement, she didn't look at me with pity. She just held my hand and said, "I'm glad you protected yourself." We got engaged on a rainy Sunday morning in our kitchen, drinking coffee. Life was incredibly stable. It was good. Then, on a Tuesday evening, just as I was reviewing some blueprints at my dining table, my cell phone buzzed. The caller ID showed an unknown number. Usually, I ignore those, but something compelled me to swipe accept. "Hello, Joshua? Is that you, boy?" The voice was raspy, thin, and weak, but I recognized it instantly. My heart skipped a beat. Grandpa! It was my dad's father. Growing up, Grandpa Arthur was the only person in that family who ever made me feel seen. He was a retired master carpenter. He used to take me out to his workshop, sit me on a wooden stool, and teach me how to read a tape measure and sand down rough oak. He was the one who taught me that working with your hands was honorable, but only if you respected the tools. After the blowout with my parents, I lost touch with the extended family. I assumed Dad had poisoned the well, telling everyone I was crazy or unstable. "It's me, kid," Grandpa coughed, a wet, rattling sound that made me wince. "I tracked down your number from your Aunt Clara. I need to see you, Josh. It's important." 2 days later, I drove out to a rundown diner on the edge of town, not far from where Grandpa lived. When I walked into the booth, I barely recognized him. The strong, barrel-chested man who used to swing me around was gone. He was terrifyingly frail, his skin paper-thin and slightly yellow. He had an oxygen tube looped over his ears. I slid into the booth across from him. "Grandpa, it's good to see you. Are you okay?" He waved a shaking, spotted hand, dismissing my concern. "Stage 4 lung cancer, Josh. Doctors give me maybe 3 months if I'm lucky. Don't give me the pity look. I lived a good, long life. But I'm putting my affairs in order, and we need to talk." He took a slow sip of black coffee. His sharp blue eyes locked onto mine. "Your father told me what happened 3 years ago. Or rather, he told me his version of it." I tensed up, preparing for the lecture, preparing to defend myself against whatever lies my parents had spun. "Grandpa, I didn't—" "Quiet," he interrupted gently. "I know your father, Joshua. I raised him. I know he's arrogant, and I know he spoils your brother rotten. Your dad told me you went crazy, smashed your own computer in a fit of jealousy, and cut the family off because Matthew was more successful than you. He said you were a bitter, unstable kid who refused to apologize." I gritted my teeth. The sheer audacity of the lie was staggering. Grandpa leaned forward. "But I know you too. I remember the 7-year-old boy who spent a week carefully building a birdhouse in my shop, only for Matthew to smash it with a hammer. I remember who got blamed for leaving the hammer out. So I called around. I talked to your Aunt Clara. I got the real story about the soda, the baseball bat, and your graduation." He reached across the table and placed his frail hand over mine. "I am so sorry, Joshua. I am sorry my son failed you as a father. He let the golden child destroy the good one." Tears pricked the corners of my eyes. It was the first time in my entire life someone from my bloodline had validated my reality. "Thank you, Grandpa. That means everything." "I'm not just here to apologize," Grandpa said, his tone shifting to pure business. "I'm changing my will. Originally, my entire estate, including the Cedar Lake property, was going to your father. I knew the Cedar Lake property. It was a stunning piece of land up north. 3 acres of dense pine forest, a private dock, and a massive, custom-built log home Grandpa had built with his own hands in the 70s. With the current real estate boom, the waterfront property was easily worth over $1 million. "I went to my lawyer yesterday," Grandpa continued. "I wrote your father out of the deed. I am leaving the Cedar Lake house, the land, and everything on it directly to you, Joshua." I froze. "Grandpa, no. You don't have to do that. Dad will go absolutely ballistic. It's going to tear the rest of the family apart. The family is already torn apart, he said fiercely, tapping a finger on the table. Your father doesn't respect money, and he doesn't respect hard work. If I leave it to him, he will sell it, hand the cash to Matthew for some idiot scheme, and lose the legacy I built. I want it to go to you. You are the only one who understands what it takes to build something that lasts. I didn't know what to say. This wasn't just a house. It was generational wealth. It was security. It was the ultimate validation. Take it, Josh. Let me do this one right thing before I go. I looked at the old man, seeing the desperate sincerity in his eyes. Slowly, I nodded. Okay, Grandpa. Thank you. 3 months later, Grandpa Arthur passed away peacefully in his sleep, and the storm that had been brewing for 3 years finally made landfall. The funeral was agonizingly tense. I attended with Chloe by my side, staying strictly in the back pews of the church. I wore a tailored dark suit. My parents and Matthew sat in the front row. They didn't approach me. Dad puffed out his chest, acting like the lord of the manor, shaking hands and accepting condolences. He already had dollar signs in his eyes. I heard him loudly whispering to my Uncle David about how he planned to list the Cedar Lake property by next month to fund Matthew's new tech startup. The official will reading took place a week later in the polished downtown offices of Sterling and Partners. Chloe squeezed my hand as we walked into the heavy oak-paneled conference room. My parents and Matthew were already there. They looked up when I walked in. Matthew scoffed, rolling his eyes. Mom gave me a look of pure disdain. Dad simply glared. What is he doing here? Dad demanded, pointing a thick finger at me. He's not part of this family anymore. Lawyer Sterling, a sharp-featured woman in her 60s with zero patience for nonsense, adjusted her glasses. Mr. Mitchell is listed as a primary beneficiary. Sit down, please. Dad frowned, looking confused, but he sat heavily in his leather chair. Ms. Sterling began reading through the standard legal jargon. She went through the minor assets first. Some savings bonds went to various cousins. The antique tools were donated. To my son, David, Ms. Sterling read, I leave my restored 1968 Porsche 911. Uncle David let out a low whistle of excitement. Dad shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He was clearly impatient to get to the main event. The $1 million lake house. Ms. Sterling turned the crisp legal page. The room was dead silent. Regarding the primary real estate asset, she read, her voice clear and projecting. The Cedar Lake property, including the 3 acres of land, the private dock, all structures and all contents therein, are to be transferred immediately and solely to my grandson Joshua Mitchell. You could have heard a pin drop. Dad's face went completely blank, processing the words. Then, the blood rushed to his face, turning his skin a mottled, violent purple. He gripped the edge of the conference table and stood up so fast his heavy leather chair crashed to the floor behind him. What did you say? Dad roared, his voice echoing off the glass walls. Read that again. That is a mistake. That house is mine. I am the eldest son. There is no mistake, sir, Miss Sterling said calmly, not intimidated in the slightest. She looked down at the document. Your father included a personal addendum. I quote, This property goes to Joshua in hopes that it serves as the foundation he deserves, and never received from his own father. Joshua knows the value of hard work. The rest of you only know the value of a handout. Matthew leaped up from his chair. He stole it. That snake got to Grandpa and manipulated him. That is my inheritance. We were going to use that money for my app. Mom burst into dramatic, heaving sobs. It was her classic performance. Maximum noise, zero actual tears. She pointed a trembling finger at me. How could you do this, Joshua? How could you poison a dying old man against his own family? You are evil. You are truly evil. I sat perfectly still. 3 years ago, this screaming match would have sent me into a panic attack. Now, I just felt exhausted by their predictability. I am contesting the will. Dad screamed, slamming his fist on the table. I will tie this up in probate court for 10 years. I will sue you for undue influence. You manipulated a sick man with dementia. Ms. Sterling finally lost her polite demeanor. She slammed her folder shut. The sharp crack made Dad flinch. You will do no such thing, Ms. Sterling snapped, her voice cold as steel. Arthur anticipated this exact temper tantrum. 2 days before he signed this updated will, I had him evaluated by 2 independent, board-certified psychiatrists. Both signed sworn affidavits stating Arthur was of perfectly sound mind, fully competent, and under zero duress. Furthermore, I have a video recording of Arthur explicitly stating his reasons for disinheriting you, detailing your financial enabling of Matthew. If you attempt to contest this in court, you will be laughed out of the room, and I will personally ensure you pay all of Joshua's legal fees. Dad's mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on a dock. The absolute legal brick wall hit him hard. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sudden, terrifying realization. He had no power here. I stood up slowly, buttoning my suit jacket. I looked down at my father, then at Matthew, and finally at my mother. You chose to invest everything into a bat-swinging toddler, I said, my voice steady and quiet. Now you get to live with the returns on that investment. Goodbye. I offered my arm to Chloe. We turned and walked out of the conference room, leaving my family screaming at the lawyer behind closed doors. This is a moment that changed everything, when I finally regained control of my life. Thank you for your patience in getting this far. You are amazing. Please like the video and leave a comment below to let me know you've been with me. This will not only help more people find this story, but also let me know that my experiences are meaningful to someone. Your support is the biggest motivation for me to continue sharing the rest of this journey. The inheritance changed my financial trajectory overnight, but I didn't quit my job. I didn't go out and buy a sports car. Instead, I drove up to Cedar Lake with Chloe, walked through the dusty, beautiful rooms Grandpa had built, and started thinking. The house needed work. The roof was missing shingles, the wraparound deck was rotting, and the windows were drafty. But the bones were solid oak. I hired contractors for the major structural work and spent my weekends up there doing the cosmetic renovations myself. Stripping wallpaper, refinishing the hardwood floors, installing modern appliances. It was therapeutic. While I was swinging a hammer up at the lake, my parents' world was rapidly imploding down in the city. I got all the updates through my Aunt Clara. She called me once a month, unable to keep the family gossip to herself. According to her, the loss of the $1 million inheritance triggered a massive financial panic for my dad. Without Grandpa's money to bail them out, the reality of their terrible financial decisions came crashing down. To fund Matthew's latest disaster, a subscription box service for alpha males that consisted of cheap imported junk, Dad had secretly taken out a third mortgage on their family home. Matthew, of course, did zero market research. He bought $60,000 worth of inventory that just sat rotting in my parents' garage. Nobody bought subscriptions. The business folded in 3 months. Your parents are drowning, Josh, Aunt Clara told me over the phone one evening. The bank is calling every day. Your father's construction business is drying up. The stress is eating them alive. I hear them screaming at each other through the windows. It's getting so bad. People are whispering about a divorce. Then the text message came. It was from Mom, the first direct contact in almost 4 years. It was a long, rambling paragraph. She said they were facing foreclosure. The bank was taking the house I grew up in. They needed exactly $80,000 to bring the mortgage current and stop the bank seizure. Joshua, the text read, family sticks together in hard times. This is your chance to be the bigger person. You inherited a $1 million property. Surely you can spare $80,000 to save your own parents from being homeless. It is your duty as a son. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. The sheer, blinding entitlement of it was breathtaking. They let my brother destroy my future, threw me out on the street, called me evil at a funeral, and now demanded $80,000 as if I owed it to them. I didn't reply. I took a screenshot of the message, saved it to a cloud folder, and blocked the number. 2 months later, the inevitable happened. The bank foreclosed. My parents were formally evicted. They had to pack 30 years of their lives into a rented U-Haul truck and move into a cramped, depressing 2-bedroom apartment across town. Matthew moved in with them, claiming he needed to regroup before his next big venture. Aunt Clara told me they were playing the victim to anyone who would listen, crying about how their wealthy, greedy son had abandoned them to the wolves. But they didn't know what I was doing behind the scenes. When their house hit the public foreclosure auction block, I made a phone call. I hired Mr. Vance, an extremely discreet real estate broker and lawyer. I instructed him to set up a shell corporation, a completely anonymous limited liability company called Miller Property Holdings, LLC. Because it was a distressed foreclosure, the house went to auction for significantly below market value. Miller Property Holdings, LLC bought it, paid in straight cash. The title was transferred, the paperwork was filed, and everything was ironclad legal. My parents had absolutely no idea that the house they had just been evicted from, the lawn they had watered for decades, now legally belonged to me. I didn't reach out to gloat. I let them sit in their cramped apartment, stewing in the consequences of their actions. I let them sweat over rent and utility bills. I let them realize that Matthew wasn't a genius entrepreneur, but an anchor dragging them to the bottom of the ocean. Meanwhile, my plans for the Cedar Lake property finally crystallized. Through my firm, I had started doing pro bono landscape design for a nonprofit organization called the Foundation for Family Financial Abuse Survivors. I had lunch with the executive director, a brilliant, tough woman named Eleanor. She told me horrific stories of young adults whose parents had stolen their identities, drained their bank accounts during custody battles, or forced them to co-sign massive loans before kicking them out. The biggest hurdle we face is housing, Eleanor told me over coffee. These kids need a safe, rent-free sanctuary where they can rebuild their credit, get therapy, and learn trades without the constant fear of their toxic families tracking them down. But buying a facility like that in a safe area is impossible on our budget. I smiled, taking a sip of my coffee. Eleanor, what if I told you I have a fully renovated, $1 million, 3-acre lakefront estate, and I want to donate it to the foundation permanently? Eleanor dropped her coffee cup, clattered against the saucer. She stared at me, speechless. We spent the next 6 months turning the lake house into the Miller Haven Trust. We built a vocational workshop in the expanded garage. We set up a computer lab with top-of-the-line PCs. We furnished 6 bedrooms to create a warm, welcoming home for young adults who had been betrayed by the people supposed to protect them. Everything was set. The grand opening was scheduled for a Saturday in June. The press was invited. The local city council was attending. And, thanks to a carefully leaked piece of information through Aunt Clara, I knew my family was planning to crash the party. They thought they saw an opportunity. They thought they could manipulate their way back into the estate. They had no idea they were walking directly into a trap that had been 3 years in the making. The morning of the grand opening was breathtaking. It was a pristine Saturday in early June up at Cedar Lake. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and a crisp, cool breeze blew off the water, carrying the scent of pine needles and fresh cedar wood. I stood on the newly constructed wraparound deck of the Miller Haven Trust, holding a cup of hot black coffee, just listening to the quiet rustle of the trees. For the past 8 months, my entire life outside of the design firm had been poured into the foundation of this property. The transformation was absolute. The rotting wood was replaced with weather-resistant composite decking. The drafty old windows were swapped for energy-efficient, soundproof glass. We had completely overhauled the plumbing, upgraded the electrical grid, and installed a state-of-the-art security system. The massive garage where Grandpa used to build cabinets was now a fully equipped vocational training center. Eleanor, the executive director of the foundation, walked up the wooden stairs and stood beside me. She was holding a clipboard thick with schedules, press releases, and vendor lists. She looked out over the 3 acres of manicured lawn, the vibrant gardens of native drought-resistant plants I had designed, and the private dock sitting peacefully on the water. "You did it, Joshua," Eleanor said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "You actually did it. You built a fortress." I took a slow sip of my coffee. "We did it, Eleanor. And Grandpa Arthur gave us the ground to build it on. Today is about the kids." By 9 in the morning, the property began to fill with life. We had invited local city council members, major philanthropic donors, community leaders, and a few local news reporters who were setting up their cameras near the front gate. Caterers were carrying trays of fresh pastries and carafes of juice into the main dining hall. But the most important people there were the first cohort of residents. 6 young adults, ranging from 18 to 24 years old. I had read all of their case files, and every single one of them broke my heart. There was a 19-year-old girl named Maya. Her parents had secretly opened 5 different credit cards in her name when she was just 14, maxed them out to fund their gambling habits, and completely destroyed her credit score before she was even old enough to vote. There was a young man named Leo, who had worked full-time through high school to save up his own college fund, only to have his mother drain the entire joint bank account the day before his tuition was due to pay for her boyfriend's legal fees. These kids had been manipulated, lied to, financially ruined, and thrown away by the exact people who were supposed to protect them. They walked around the beautiful estate with wide, disbelieving eyes. They ran their hands over the polished granite countertops in the kitchen. They looked at their own private bedrooms, complete with solid doors that locked from the inside. They finally had a sanctuary, a place where they could live rent-free for up to a year while they attended financial literacy courses, repaired their credit, found stable jobs, and saved their salary for a real future. Chloe came up behind me and wrapped her arms around my waist, resting her chin on my shoulder. She was wearing a beautiful summer dress, her smile radiant. "Are you ready for the ribbon cutting?" she asked. "I am," I said, turning to kiss her forehead. "Just making sure everything is perfect." I was walking across the front lawn, checking the seating arrangement of the folding chairs we had set up for the presentation, when I heard it. The unmistakable, sputtering, grinding sound of a failing engine. I stopped. I turned toward the long, winding gravel driveway that led from the main county road to the estate gates. A rusted, faded blue sedan was struggling up the incline. The muffler was dragging slightly, scraping against the rocks, and a thick plume of dark gray exhaust smoke trailed behind it. I recognized that car. It belonged to Matthew. He had traded in the expensive sports car my parents bought him years ago because he couldn't afford the insurance premiums anymore. My stomach gave a brief, involuntary twist, an old reflex from childhood. But I took a deep breath, and my pulse instantly steadied. The anxiety was gone. I was not the terrified college student kneeling in spilled soda anymore. I was the owner of this land. The rusted sedan lurched through the open iron gates and parked awkwardly half on the grass, right next to a gleaming news van. The doors creaked open with a loud metallic groan. My parents and Matthew climbed out. The sheer physical degradation of all 3 of them was shocking. It had been over 3 years since the funeral, and they looked like they had aged a decade. Dad had gained a significant amount of weight. His face was red and bloated, his posture slumped, the arrogant puff of his chest completely gone. He was wearing a polo shirt that was frayed at the collar. Mom looked hardened, fragile, and exhausted. Deep, bitter lines bracketed her mouth. The expensive salon haircuts and designer purses were gone, replaced by unkempt hair and a faded cardigan. And then there was Matthew, the golden child. He looked terrible. His hair was greasy, his eyes were sunken with dark circles, and he was wearing a wrinkled t-shirt with a visible stain near the hem. He looked nervously around the property, his eyes darting to the catered food tables and the well-dressed donors mingling on the patio. They stood by their broken-down car, taking in the sheer magnitude of the renovated estate. The gleaming windows, the fresh paint, the massive new deck, the professionally landscaped gardens. I could see the greed reigniting in their eyes. They thought this was my personal vacation home. They thought I was living out a billionaire fantasy while they were rotting in a tiny apartment. Mom spotted me standing near the chairs. Her face instantly transformed into a mask of pure, desperate warmth. She waved her hand frantically. "Joshua! Oh my goodness, Joshua! Look at you!" she called out, her voice loud and shrill, trying to sound like a proud mother reuniting with her beloved son. I didn't move. I stood my ground, my hands clasped loosely behind my back. Chloe stepped up to stand right beside me, presenting a solid, united front. I gave Eleanor a subtle nod, signaling her to hold the security team back for a moment. I wanted this conversation to happen. They walked across the lawn toward me. Dad tried to force a confident stride, but he just looked tired. "Son," Dad said, his voice carrying that old, forced casual tone he always used when he wanted something from me. He extended a hand. "It's been a long time. Place looks incredible. You really fixed up Arthur's old cabin. Obviously, you had the money to do it." I looked at his outstretched hand. I did not take it. I just stared at him, my expression completely neutral. Dad slowly lowered his hand, his face flushing with embarrassment. He cleared his throat. "Right, well, we heard through the grapevine that you were having a big party up here today. We figured it was time to let bygones be bygones. Family is family, right? You are trespassing," I said, my voice clear, calm, and carrying easily across the space between us. "This is private property. You were not invited." Matthew stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. He tried to puff himself up, tried to reclaim the old dynamic where he could just bully me into submission. "Don't act like a snob, Josh. This was Grandpa's house. It belongs to the family. You can't just lock us out of our own legacy because you're holding a grudge over a stupid computer." I looked at Matthew. The anger I used to feel toward him was entirely gone. Looking at him now, I just felt pity. He was a 29-year-old man who had never accomplished a single thing on his own, standing on my property in a stained shirt, demanding respect he hadn't earned. "It hasn't been Grandpa's house for over 3 years," I corrected him smoothly. "And as of yesterday, it isn't my house either. And we are not family. You are simply the people who broke my property, threw me out, and then tried to guilt me into paying off your mortgage." Mom stepped forward, her eyes instantly filling with tears. It was an incredible performance. On cue, the lower lip trembled, the eyes brimmed with moisture. It was the exact same guilt trip she used to run on me when I was a teenager to make me give my allowance to Matthew. "Joshua, please," Mom begged, her voice cracking perfectly. "We have suffered enough. Do you have any idea how hard it has been for us? The bank took our home. We lost everything. We are living in a tiny, roach-infested 2-bedroom apartment. The stress is destroying us. Your father and I, we're barely holding it together. We are on the brink of a divorce. Matthew can't find a decent job because the economy is so bad. We are your blood. You have all of this wealth. We need help." I looked at her. I echoed the exact words my father had spoken to me when I begged them to help me with my college tuition over a decade ago. "It sounds like a budgeting problem, Mom," I said coldly. "Maybe you should have planned your finances better." Dad's face turned bright red. The polite facade shattered. "You arrogant little punk. We came here to offer you an olive branch. We are willing to forgive you for humiliating us at the funeral. We are willing to forgive you for abandoning us in our time of need. We are ready to be a family again." The audacity was genuinely breathtaking. They were standing on an estate worth well over $1 million, completely destitute because of their own disastrous choices, entirely dependent on Matthew's rusted car, and they were offering me forgiveness. Matthew looked around the massive property, his eyes wide with desperate calculation. He saw the huge garage, the sprawling deck, the multiple bedrooms. "Look, Josh," Matthew said, trying to sound reasonable. "You obviously have a huge place down in the city. You work all the time. You can't maintain a massive estate like this by yourself. Let us move in here, just temporarily, to get back on our feet." Mom nodded vigorously, eagerly jumping onto Matthew's terrible idea. "Yes, exactly. It would be perfect. We could be the caretakers. Your father can fix things around the property. I can cook and clean for you when you visit. Matthew can handle the landscaping. You wouldn't have to hire expensive strangers. Family looking after family. We would earn our keep. I looked at the three of them. I really looked at them. They hadn't changed one single bit. The poverty hadn't humbled them. Losing their house hadn't taught them a lesson. They still viewed me exactly as they always had, as a resource to be extracted, a bank to be robbed, a safety net they felt utterly entitled to fall into whenever their own terrible decisions caught up with them. They genuinely believed that they could just walk back into my life, take over this $1 million estate, and turn me back into their personal ATM. You want to live here? I asked, keeping my voice very quiet. Dad's eyes lit up with desperate hope. He actually smiled. It would solve everything, son. It really would. It would help us so much, and it would be good for you to have your family around again. We could start over. I understand, I said. I turned away from them and pointed toward the front gates. Near the entrance, standing on a beautiful stone pedestal, was a large wooden sign. It was currently covered by a heavy blue velvet tarp, waiting for the official unveiling ceremony that was supposed to happen in 30 minutes. Matthew, I commanded, my voice suddenly ringing with absolute authority. Walk over there and pull the tarp down. Matthew blinked, confused by the sudden order. But the tone of my voice triggered an instinctual obedience. He slowly walked over to the stone pedestal, grabbed the thick gold rope attached to the velvet tarp, and gave it a hard yank. The velvet fell away, pooling on the grass. The sign was magnificent. It was carved from solid, polished mahogany, with deep gold leaf lettering engraved into the wood. The sun hit the gold, making the words gleam brightly for everyone to see. It read, "The Miller Haven Trust, a sanctuary for survivors of family financial abuse and exploitation, providing secure housing, education, and legal support for young adults rebuilding their lives." Matthew stared at the sign. His mouth actually fell open. He read the words over and over again, his brain struggling to process the reality of what he was looking at. Mom gasped. It was a real gasp this time, sharp and breathless. She stumbled backward a half step. Dad's face went completely pale, all the blood draining from his bloated cheeks. "What is this?" Dad demanded, his voice trembling. "Joshua, what is this nonsense?" I walked slowly toward them, closing the distance until I was standing just a few feet away. I looked my father dead in the eye. "This isn't a vacation home," I explained, my voice echoing across the quiet lawn. "This property no longer belongs to me. As of yesterday morning, the deed was legally transferred to a registered 501(c)(3) nonprofit organization. I donated the entire estate, 100% of it." Mom clutched her chest, her breathing turning shallow. You gave it away? You gave away $1 million lake house? To strangers? When your own flesh and blood are starving in an apartment? "They aren't strangers," I said fiercely. "They are my real family now. See, family isn't about biology. Family is about the people who have your back. The people who don't laugh when your life's work is destroyed. The people who don't steal your college fund to buy sports cars for their favorite child." I pointed toward the main house, where Maya and Leo were standing on the porch, watching the confrontation. "Starting today," I told my parents, "this house is going to host kids who have been financially terrorized by people exactly like you. Kids who had their credit scores ruined by their mothers. Kids who had their savings accounts drained by their fathers. They are going to live here, completely rent-free, safe from the monsters who raised them." Matthew lost his mind. His face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. He kicked the wooden leg of the sign pedestal. "You are insane," he screamed, his voice cracking. "You gave away my money. You vindictive psychopath. You did this just to spite us. You threw away millions just to watch us suffer." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I had all the power. "I didn't do this to spite you, Matthew," I said coldly. I did this so the next kid who has his computer smashed by a jealous brother has a safe place to sleep. I built the safety net you people stole from me. The silence on the lawn was absolute. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. The reporters near the gate had their cameras pointed squarely at the scene, capturing every second of my family's public humiliation. Dad looked at the massive, beautiful house. A house that, in another timeline, could have been his. A house he lost because he couldn't stop enabling a failure. He looked at the manicured lawns, the private dock, the wealth that was permanently, legally out of his reach. He looked defeated, utterly, completely crushed. But I wasn't finished. I had one more piece of business to settle. I stepped closer to my parents, lowering my voice so only the three of them could hear me. The final twist of the knife. "You know, Mom, you sent me a text a few months ago," I whispered. "You told me the bank was foreclosing on your house. The house you lived in for 30 years. The house I grew up in. You begged me for $80,000 to save it." Mom looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear, sensing the trap closing around her. "Yes, and you ignored me. You let us lose our home." "I didn't ignore you," I said softly, a cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. "I just didn't want to give you the cash to waste on another one of Matthew's failed subscription boxes." I paused, letting the silence stretch out, letting the anticipation build. "When your house went to the county foreclosure auction," I continued, enunciating every single word with lethal precision, "it was purchased by an anonymous shell corporation called Miller Property Holdings, LLC. They paid cash. Bought it for pennies on the dollar." Dad's eyes widened. He stopped breathing. The gears in his head finally clicked into place. "I am the sole proprietor of Miller Property Holdings, LLC," I whispered. "I own your house. I hold the deed. I bought it, I gutted it, and I am renting it out to a lovely young couple with 2 golden retrievers. They pay their rent on time every month." The psychological impact of those words was like a physical shockwave hitting them. My mother let out a small, strangled whimper and covered her mouth with both hands. Her knees actually buckled slightly, and Dad had to grab her arm to keep her from collapsing onto the grass. The realization that the son they had abused, neglected, and thrown away now legally owned the very walls they used to sleep inside was too much for their arrogant minds to process. I didn't just survive their abuse. I owned their past. "You," Dad choked out, his voice a hoarse, ragged whisper. "You bought our house." "I bought an investment property," I corrected him smoothly. "And now I need you to get off my land, before I have the police arrest you for criminal trespassing." I turned my back on them. I didn't wait to see them leave. I walked back up the stairs of the deck, took Chloe's hand, and walked into the dining hall to greet the donors. I watched through the massive bay windows of the dining hall as the aftermath unfolded on the front lawn. My parents and Matthew stood completely frozen for a long minute. Dad looked like he wanted to yell, to threaten me with a lawyer, to scream about lawsuits and family loyalty. But the fight was completely drained out of him. The absolute reality of his powerlessness had finally broken his ego. He had no money, no leverage, no legal standing, and no house. Mom was weeping, and for the first time in my life, I knew the tears were absolutely real. They were tears of profound regret, not for how she treated me, but for the wealth and comfort she had permanently lost access to. And then, the beautiful poetry of toxic families playing out their inevitable conclusion happened right there in the driveway. Matthew, realizing that his parents were completely bankrupt and could no longer serve as his personal ATM, instantly turned on them. I couldn't hear the words through the soundproof glass, but I could see the vicious argument. Matthew was screaming at Dad, pointing a finger in his face, blaming him for losing the inheritance, blaming him for the foreclosure. Dad yelled back, finally showing a spark of anger toward his golden boy, shoving Matthew in the chest. Mom stood between them, sobbing hysterically, trying to keep her fractured, toxic world from crumbling. It was pathetic. A nest of vipers finally turning their fangs on each other because they had run out of prey. Eventually, Matthew threw his hands up in disgust, got into the driver's seat of the rusted sedan, and slammed the door. Mom and Dad hurriedly climbed into the back, looking like exhausted, defeated prisoners. The engine coughed, spat a cloud of black smoke, and the car slowly crawled down the gravel driveway, through the iron gates, and disappeared down the county road. That was the last time I ever saw my family. The grand opening of the Miller Haven Trust was a massive success. The local news ran a beautiful segment on the evening broadcast, highlighting the stories of financial abuse and the sanctuary we had built. Donations poured into the foundation over the next few weeks, allowing us to immediately begin planning a second housing location closer to the city. Time moves differently when you aren't constantly waiting for an attack. 6 months flew by in a blur of peace and productivity. The first cohort of young adults at the Haven flourished. Maya, the girl whose credit was ruined by her parents, secured a job at a local graphic design firm and, with the help of our pro bono financial advisors, successfully disputed the fraudulent credit cards and started building a real savings account. Leo finished his vocational training, got his welding certification, and started pulling in a fantastic salary at a manufacturing plant. Watching them take control of their lives was the most fulfilling experience I had ever known. As for my biological family, I didn't actively seek out information, but Aunt Clara, true to her nature, called me a few days before Thanksgiving with the final update. The ultimate, ironic twist to their story. "It's over, Joshua," Aunt Clara said over the phone, her voice a mix of sadness and vindication. "The entire family unit has imploded." "What happened, Aunt Clara?" I asked, sitting on my living room couch with my rescue dog resting his head on my lap. "Your parents are getting a divorce," she revealed. "The stress of the tiny apartment and the debt finally broke them. Your mother moved out and is staying on a friend's couch." "But that's not the craziest part." I raised an eyebrow. "Worse than a divorce? Your father actually hired a cheap lawyer," Aunt Clara said, letting out a dry chuckle. "He is officially suing Matthew for fraud. He claims the $60,000 he pulled out of the house equity from Matthew's subscription box business was a formal loan, not a gift, and he is trying to garnish Matthew's wages to get it back. Assuming Matthew ever actually gets a job, that is. They are viciously tearing each other apart in mediation." I leaned back against the cushions, staring at the ceiling. The poetic justice of it all was almost cinematic. For 30 years, my parents had enabled Matthew's delusions, funded his failures, and protected him from every consequence, even at the cost of my future. And now, the very monster they had lovingly created was the one destroying them in a courtroom. They had finally been forced to drink the poison they spent decades brewing. "Thanks for telling me, Clara," I said quietly. "I hope they find whatever peace they deserve." I hung up the phone, blocked the thought of them from my mind, and went back to planning my wedding. Chloe and I got married the following spring. We didn't want a massive, stressful event in a stuffy cathedral. We wanted it to mean something. We held the ceremony up at the Cedar Lake property, right on the expansive green lawn overlooking the water. It was a beautiful, intimate afternoon. The sun was warm, and the breeze off the lake made the pine trees sway gently. We invited 50 of our closest friends and colleagues. Mr. Harrison, my boss and mentor, was there, beaming with pride. Eleanor was sitting in the front row, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. Maya, Leo, and the rest of the kids from the Miller Haven program attended, helping to set up the chairs and organize the catering. They felt more like my younger siblings than Matthew ever did. Aunt Clara and Uncle David came, representing the only fragments of my bloodline that I still respected. As I stood under the floral archway, watching Chloe walk down the grass aisle in her simple, elegant white dress, a profound sense of clarity washed over me. I looked at the crowd of people smiling back at me. I looked at the massive, sturdy house Grandpa Arthur had built, now serving as a beacon of hope for kids who needed it most. I didn't miss my parents. I didn't miss my brother. I didn't feel a single ounce of guilt for leaving those empty chairs at my college graduation, or for locking them out of this estate. Because looking out at that crowd, I realized I hadn't lost a family at all. I had simply pruned away the dead, rotting branches so the healthy parts of the tree could finally grow. I had built my own family, a family based on mutual respect, unconditional support, and actual love, not just the random accident of shared genetics. We said our vows as the sun began to set over the lake, painting the water in brilliant shades of orange and gold. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, the cheers from our chosen family echoed across the water, loud and joyful. I was 32 years old. I had a career I loved, a woman who understood my soul, a legacy that was actively changing lives, and a heart that was finally free of the heavy, toxic chains of my past. Before I end this video, I want to take a moment to talk about what this entire journey really means. The hardest lesson I ever had to learn, and it's one that goes against everything society conditions us to believe, is that blood does not equal obligation. We are taught from a very young age that family is everything, that you must forgive unconditionally, and that you must set yourself on fire just to keep your relatives warm. But financial abuse is real. Emotional manipulation is real. When parents use one child as a bank account or an emotional punching bag to enable the destructive behavior of a golden child, that is not love. That is exploitation. You have the absolute right to draw a line in the sand. Walking away from toxic family members doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you a survivor. Protecting your peace, your finances, and your mental health is the most vital responsibility you have to yourself. True family is built on respect, reciprocity, and safety. If the people who share your DNA cannot offer you that, you are allowed to build a table of your own and invite people who actually value your presence. I want to know your thoughts on this. Have you ever had to set a difficult boundary with a toxic family member to protect your own future? How did you find the strength to walk away? Share your perspective in the comments below. Or, if this story resonated with you and you value the lessons shared here today, simply leave the word "good" in the comments so I know this connected with you. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next one.